New York, February 1935. There are prisons, and then there are icy hells built to break men's souls. In 1935, Clinton Correctional Facility, better known to the underworld as Dannemora, was not just a cage, it was a freezer. Sitting near the Canadian border, tucked away in the Adirondack Mountains, the temperatures in February routinely dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The wind howled through the cell blocks like a dying animal, and the stone walls were so cold that if you leaned against them too long, your skin would stick to the frost. They called it Little Siberia, and in the winter of 1935, it was about to become a slaughterhouse. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 30 years old. He wasn't yet the Godfather who would one day rule Harlem from a penthouse. In 1935, he was inmate number 4826, serving time in the hardest penitentiary in New York State. He was a long way from the jazz clubs on Lenox Avenue. Here, there was no music, only the sound of boots on concrete, the clanging of iron doors, and the whispers of men plotting murder. Bumpy was smart. Smarter than the guards, smarter than the warden, and certainly smarter than the low-level thugs who filled the yard. He kept his head down. He worked in the boiler room, a place that offered two things: warmth from the brutal cold and noise, deafening, mechanical noise. But Bumpy had a problem that couldn't be solved by keeping his head down. His problem was in New York City, sitting in a steakhouse, drinking expensive scotch, Dutch Schultz. The Dutchman was losing control of the numbers racket in Harlem, and he blamed one man, Bumpy Johnson. Even from a prison cell, Bumpy's name carried weight on the streets. As long as Bumpy was alive, the black gamblers in Harlem refused to bow down to the Italian and Jewish mobs. So Dutch Schultz made a call. He couldn't get to Bumpy himself, but he knew people who could. He reached out to a contact inside the Italian crime families, and a contract was issued. The price, $5,000. In the middle of the Great Depression, $5,000 was enough to buy a house, a car, and a new life. Inside Dannemora, it was enough to buy a kingdom. The contract landed on the desk of an inmate named Salvatore Sally Di Marco. Sally Di Marco was a predator. He was serving 20 years for murder and racketeering. He ran the Italian faction inside Dannemora with an iron fist. He controlled the contraband, he controlled the gambling, and he owned half the guards on the payroll. Sally wasn't big, but he was vicious. He had eyes like a shark, flat, dead, and always moving. Sally had two lieutenants who were never far from his side. First was Vinny the Hammer Rossi, a former heavyweight boxer who had taken too many hits to the head. Vinny wasn't smart, but he was terrifyingly strong. He could snap a broomstick with one hand. He was the muscle. Second was Paolo Rixai. If Vinny was the hammer, Paolo was the needle. He was small, skinny, and silent. Paolo was a master of the shiv. He could fashion a lethal weapon out of a spoon, a toothbrush, or a piece of bedspring. He didn't fight face to face. He waited until you were sleeping or eating or using the latrine. On the morning of February 3, 1935, a corrupt guard slipped a note under Sally Di Marco's cell door. It was brief. The Dutchman pays $5,000. The target is Johnson. Make it messy. Sally smiled. He burned the note with a match, lighting his cigarette with the flame. He looked at Vinny and Paolo, who were sitting on the bunk playing cards. "Boys," Sally said, exhaling a cloud of blue smoke, "we just won the lottery, but we got some work to do." For the next 4 days, they watched Bumpy. They studied his routine. They knew he ate at 6:00 a.m. They knew he walked the yard at noon, always alone, always near the wall where no one could get behind him. Bumpy was careful. He knew the Dutchman wanted him dead. He slept with one eye open and moved with the calculated grace of a jungle cat. But everyone makes a mistake eventually, or, in Bumpy's case, everyone has a job to do. February 7, 1935, 2:45 p.m. The boiler room. It was the bowels of the prison, a labyrinth of pipes, steam valves, and roaring furnaces that kept the prison from freezing over. The air was thick with coal dust and the hiss of escaping steam. Visibility was poor. The noise was deafening, a constant thump hiss of the massive pistons. Bumpy was alone, shoveling coal into furnace number 3. He was sweating, his prison shirt tied around his waist, revealing the lean, corded muscle of his back. The shovel scraped against the concrete floor, scritch, scrape, throw. He didn't hear the door open, the machinery was too loud. But Bumpy Johnson had an instinct, a sixth sense that had kept him alive on the streets of Harlem since he was a teenager. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, the air pressure in the room shifted. Bumpy stopped shoveling. He didn't turn around immediately. He gripped the handle of the heavy iron shovel tighter. He took a breath, tasting the cold dust. Then he spun around. They were there, 3 of them. Sally DiMarco stood in the middle, a cruel smile on his face. In his hand he held a 6-inch shank made from a sharpened file, wrapped in electrical tape. To his left was Vinny, cracking his knuckles, his massive frame blocking the only exit. To his right, Paolo, crouching slightly, holding a jagged piece of glass wrapped in a rag. They had cut the line to the guard station. There was no one coming. "Hello, Bumpy," Sally shouted over the roar of the furnace. "Getting warm in here, isn't it?" Bumpy didn't speak. He assessed the situation in a microsecond. 3 attackers, 1 exit blocked, no weapons except the shovel. The odds were 0. "The Dutchman sends his love," Sally said, "and his money." Vinny moved first. He charged like a bull, head down, arms wide, intending to tackle Bumpy and pin him to the ground so the others could stab him. Bumpy swung the shovel. It was a vicious, horizontal arc. The iron blade connected with Vinny's shoulder with a sickening crack. Vinny grunted, stumbling back, but he didn't go down. He was too big. He shook it off and lunged again, grabbing the handle of the shovel. He wrenched it out of Bumpy's hands and tossed it aside like a toothpick. Now Bumpy was unarmed. Paolo saw his opening. He darted in from the side, silent and fast. He slashed with the glass. Bumpy twisted his body, but not fast enough. The glass sliced through his pants and into his thigh. A spray of bright red blood hit the gray floor. Bumpy groaned, stumbling back against the hot pipes of the furnace. The heat seared his skin, but the adrenaline masked the pain. He kicked out, catching Paolo in the chest, sending the little man skidding across the floor. But then Sally was there. Sally didn't play games. While Bumpy was dealing with Paolo, Sally stepped in close and thrust the file forward. Thud! The shank went into Bumpy's abdomen, just below the ribs. Bumpy gasped, the air left his lungs. Sally pulled it out and stabbed again, this time into the shoulder. Thud! And again into the side. Bumpy fell to his knees. The world was spinning. The heat, the noise, the blood. It was all blurring together. He could smell the coal. He could smell Sally's cheap cologne. "Hold him up," Sally ordered. Vinny grabbed Bumpy by the arms, hauling him up, pinning his back against the scorching hot furnace. Bumpy's legs were useless. Blood was pouring from 3 distinct wounds, soaking his trousers and pooling around his boots. Sally stepped closer, wiping the bloody shank on his shirt. He looked Bumpy in the eye. "You should have stayed in Harlem, boy," Sally whispered. "This is a white man's world up here." Sally raised the shank for the kill shot, aimed directly at the heart. This was it, the end of the legend. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't thinking about dying. He was thinking about living. His eyes darted to the side. There, protruding from the pipe next to Vinny's head, was a pressure release valve, a small, rusty wheel. As Sally thrust the knife forward, Bumpy summoned the last ounce of strength he had. He didn't try to block the knife. Instead, he threw his head back and head-butted Vinny in the face, breaking the giant's nose. Vinny roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Bumpy twisted, the shank missing his heart by an inch and slicing across his chest instead. It was a shallow cut, but it bought him a second. With his free hand, Bumpy reached up and grabbed the pressure valve. He didn't turn it, he yanked it. The valve was old, the pipe was corroded. Under the force of Bumpy's desperation, the metal sheared off. A jet of superheated steam exploded from the pipe at 200 degrees. HISSSSSSS. The steam blasted directly into Vinny's face. The giant screamed, a sound that cut through the mechanical noise of the room. He let go of Bumpy, clawing at his boiling skin, stumbling backward, blind and agonizing. In the fusion, the steam cloud filled the space between Bumpy and Sally. Sally covered his face, coughing, waving the shank blindly. Bumpy dropped to the floor. He was bleeding badly. Every heartbeat pumped more life out of him. He crawled. He crawled through the cold dust under the maze of pipes, dragging his wounded leg. He made it to the heavy iron door. He reached up, his bloody hand slipping on the handle once, twice. Finally, he turned it. The door swung open, spilling him out into the main corridor just as the shift change whistle blew. Dozens of inmates were walking by. Guards were stationed at the gates. They all stopped. There, lying on the immaculate linoleum floor, was Bumpy Johnson, covered in coal dust and blood. Behind him, the boiler room door was open, steam billowing out like the breath of a dragon. Sally DiMarco stood in the doorway, the bloody shank still in his hand. He froze. He saw the guards. He saw the witnesses. He realized his mistake immediately. Bumpy looked up at the ceiling. The lights were too bright. His vision was tunneling. He saw the boots of the guards running toward him. He felt the cold floor against his back. He heard a guard yell, "Man down, get the doctor." Bumpy closed his eyes. The last thing he heard was Vinny screaming in the boiler room and the sound of Sally DiMarco dropping the knife. The Italians thought it was over. They thought Bumpy Johnson was dead. They celebrated that night in their cells. They drank toilet wine and laughed about the charcoal stain they had wiped off the map. They sent word to Dutch Schultz that the job was done. But they were wrong. Bumpy wasn't dead, he was just angry. And in Dannemora, anger keeps you warm. 3 weeks later, late February 1935. Pain is a teacher. Some men break under its ruler. Others, the rare ones, take notes. For 3 weeks, Bumpy Johnson lay in the prison infirmary, his body a map of stitches and bandages. 4 stab wounds, 28 stitches, a fever that burned hot enough to melt the ice on the window pane. The prison doctor, a cynical man named Dr. Evans who smelled of gin and iodine, had bet the guards $5 that inmate 4826 wouldn't last the night. Dr. Evans lost his $5. Bumpy didn't die. He didn't even moan in his sleep. He lay there, staring at the cracked plaster of the ceiling, listening. He listened to the guards gossiping about their wives. He listened to the rattle of the medicine cart. And he listened to the whispers of the porters mopping the floors. Information flowed into the infirmary like a draft under the door. He learned that Sally DiMarco was strutting around the yard like a peacock. He learned that Vinny, the hammer, was telling anyone who would listen how he had held Bumpy down. He learned that the Italians were already spending the Dutchman's money on contraband whiskey and cigars. They thought the war was over. They thought Bumpy Johnson was a broken toy, discarded in the hospital wing, waiting to be shipped out or buried. But on the morning of the 21st day, the warden came to visit. Warden Lawton was a hard man, but he respected order, and an attempted murder in his boiler room was disorder. He stood over Bumpy's bed, arms crossed. "Johnson," the warden barked, "we found the shank. We know it was DiMarco and his boys. You give me a statement, I put them in the hole for 6 months. You testify, I add 10 years to their sentences." Bumpy slowly turned his head. His eyes were clear, dark, and devoid of fear. "I don't know what you're talking about, warden," Bumpy rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "Don't play games with me," Lawton snapped. "You were stabbed 4 times. Who did it?" "I slipped," Bumpy said calmly. "Accident in the boiler room, fell on some scrap metal." The warden stared at him for a long moment. He knew the code. Omerta. Snitches get stitches. But for a man like Bumpy, it wasn't just about fear of retaliation. It was about pride. If he went to the warden, he was admitting he needed protection. And a king does not ask for protection. "Have it your way," the warden sneered, turning to leave. "But next time, Johnson, they won't miss." "There won't be a next time," Bumpy whispered to the empty room. 2 days later, Bumpy was released back into the general population. He was weak. He walked with a limp, favoring his left leg where the glass had sliced the muscle. He had lost 15 pounds. His uniform hung loosely on his frame. When he walked into the mess hall for the first time, the room went silent. 600 men stopped eating. At the far table, the Italian crew sat. Sally DiMarco froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Vinny the Hammer squinted, looking confused. Paolo looked down at his tray, nervously tapping his fingers. Bumpy didn't look at them. He didn't acknowledge their existence. He got his tray of slop, walked to a table in the corner occupied by the black inmates, and sat down. He ate slowly. He knew every eye was on him. He knew they were waiting for him to attack, to scream, to do something. But Bumpy did nothing. He just ate. That night, in the darkness of his cell, the real work began. Bumpy knew he couldn't win a physical war, not yet. Vinny was too strong and Sally had too many soldiers. If Bumpy attacked now, he would be crushed. He needed to dismantle them, piece by piece, like taking apart a clock. He started with the strongest piece, Vinny the Hammer Rossi. Vinny was the muscle. Without Vinny, Sally was just a loudmouth with money, and Paolo was a coward with a knife. Vinny was the shield. Bumpy called for a meeting, not in the yard but in the library during the quiet hour. He met with an inmate named Smitty. Smitty was a small, wire-thin man doing life for arson. He worked in the maintenance crew. He was the guy who fixed the pipes, the locks, and the gym equipment. Smitty owed Bumpy. 2 years ago, Bumpy had stopped a gang from taking Smitty's commissary. "I need a favor," Bumpy said, pretending to read a book on legal statutes. "Name it, Bump," Smitty whispered, looking around nervously. "The weight pile in the yard," Bumpy said. "Vinny lifts every day at 3:00 p.m. He likes to show off. Heaviest weights he can find, the bench press." "Yeah, I know. He benches 300 pounds, makes a big scene." "The bolts on the left side of the bar catch," Bumpy said softly. "They look rusty." Smitty looked at Bumpy. He understood immediately. "Metal fatigue is a terrible thing in this cold weather," Smitty murmured. "Especially if someone swapped the steel bolt for a lead one. It would hold, for a while, until there was too much weight." "Accident." "TS happen," Bumpy said, turning the page. "Just like I slipped in the boiler room." "Consider it done." February 28, 1935, the yard. The sun was out, but it offered no heat. The yard was a sea of gray coats and stomping boots. Steam rose from the mouths of hundreds of men. In the corner near the north wall was the weight pile. It was crude, rusty iron bars and concrete blocks poured into buckets. Vinny the Hammer was putting on a show. He had loaded the bar with every plate available, 310 pounds. He was shirtless, despite the freezing temperature, sweat glistening on his massive chest. He wanted everyone to see the strength that had nearly killed Bumpy Johnson. Sally DiMarco stood nearby, smoking, laughing. "Come on, Vinny, show these weaklings what a real man looks like." Bumpy sat on a bench 50 yards away, huddled in his coat, playing chess with an old lifer. He didn't look up. He moved a pawn. "Check," Bumpy said softly. "You're rushing," the old man grumbled. "Timing is everything," Bumpy replied. Across the yard, Vinny lay back on the bench. He gripped the cold steel bar. He grunted, his muscles bulging as he lifted the massive weight off the rack. "Up, up, up," Sally chanted. Vinny lowered the bar to his chest, his face turning purple with exertion. He roared, pushing the weight back up. 1 rep, 2 reps. "Easy money," Vinny shouted, locking his arms out. He went for a third. On the downward motion, the weight of the iron shifted slightly. The bar hit the catch on the left side. Usually, the steel bolt would hold. But today, there was no steel bolt. There was a soft lead screw that Smitty had painted silver. Snap! The sound was like a gunshot. The left side of the rack collapsed instantly. Gravity took over. The 300 pounds of iron didn't just fall, it twisted. The bar slipped from Vinny's sweaty grip and crashed down, but because the left side gave way first, the bar came down diagonally. It slammed directly across Vinny's chest, specifically onto the left side of his ribcage. The sound of bones shattering was audible across the entire yard. Crunch! Vinny didn't scream at first. The air had been driven out of him so violently that he couldn't make a sound. His eyes bulged out of his head. He thrashed, legs kicking wildly, pinned under the crushing weight. Then the air came back, and with it the scream. It was a high, jagged shriek that didn't sound like a man. It sounded like an animal caught in a trap. "Get it off him, get it off," Sally screamed, trying to lift the weights, but he wasn't strong enough. It took 4 other inmates to finally heave the bar off Vinny's chest. Vinny couldn't stand. He was gasping, coughing up pink, frothy blood. His chest was caved in on the left side. "My back, I can't feel my legs," Vinny wheezed, clutching Sally's arm. The bar hadn't just broken his ribs, the torque had snapped a vertebrae when his body twisted against the bench. Guards came running, whistles blowing. They loaded Vinny onto a stretcher. The once feared giant was weeping like a child, his legs dragging uselessly behind him. From his bench, 50 yards away, Bumpy Johnson finally looked up from his chessboard. He watched them carry Vinny away. He saw the panic in Sally DiMarco's eyes. Sally was looking around the yard, wild and confused, trying to understand how the equipment had failed. For a brief second, Sally's eyes met Bumpy's. Bumpy didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he just stared. A cold, flat, dead stare that said everything. "One down." "Your move," Bumpy said to the old man across the chessboard. The old man looked at the commotion, then back at Bumpy. He shivered, and it wasn't from the cold. "You're a dangerous man, Johnson," the old man whispered. "I'm just playing the game," Bumpy replied. Vinny was gone, the muscle was removed. Now Sally DiMarco was exposed, and Paolo, the sneak, he was next. But for Paolo, Bumpy had something much colder in mind. The temperature in Dannemora was dropping again. Night was coming, and the shadows were getting longer. March 1935, the thaw. Fear is a virus. It spreads faster than the flu in a cell block. With Vinny the hammer lying in the infirmary with a broken spine, the balance of power in Dannemora shifted overnight. The Italians were no longer the predators. They were the prey. Sally DiMarco was terrified. He stopped going to the yard. He stopped gambling. He stayed in his cell, chain-smoking, his eyes darting at every shadow. Beside him was Paolo Rixai, the sneak. Paolo was useless without Vinny. He was a rat who had lost his bodyguard. Bumpy Johnson watched them crumble from a distance. He didn't need to lift a finger. He just needed to wind the clock and let it tick. Target number 2, Paolo Rixai. Paolo was paranoid. He slept with a shiv under his pillow. He knew Bumpy was coming, but Bumpy didn't come with a knife. He came with a whisper. Bumpy knew that the warden was cracking down on contraband weapons after the boiler room incident. The guards were doing random sweeps. Bumpy also knew that the guards were lazy. They only searched cells when they had a hot tip. On the morning of March 5th, a porter, a quiet man who mopped the floors and whom Sally DiMarco had kicked a week earlier, slipped into Paolo's cell while the Italians were at breakfast. He didn't take anything, he left something. A rusty 8-inch screwdriver stolen from the maintenance shop. He taped it under Paolo's mattress, not hidden well, just hidden enough to be found. An hour later, an anonymous note landed on the captain of the guard's desk. Cell 304, Rixai, planning to stab a guard. In Dannemora, threatening a guard was a death sentence. At 10:00 a.m., the raid squad hit cell 304. They tore the room apart. They flipped the mattress. The screwdriver clattered to the floor. Paolo's face went white. "That's not mine, I swear it's a setup." The guards didn't care. They dragged Paolo out by his hair. They beat him in the corridor until he stopped screaming. But the beating wasn't the punishment. The punishment was the box. Solitary confinement in Dannemora was located in the basement. No windows, no light. And in March of 1935, the heating pipes to the basement had mysteriously malfunctioned. They threw Paolo into the hole naked. No blanket, no clothes, just a bucket and the freezing concrete floor. The temperature in the box was 5 degrees. The first night Paolo screamed for Sally to help him. The second night he whimpered for God. The third night there was silence. When they opened the door on the fourth morning, Paolo Rixai was huddled in the corner, covered in frost. He was alive, but barely. His mind had snapped from the sensory deprivation and the hypothermia. He was gibbering like a baby, his fingers black from frostbite. They hauled him to the asylum wing. Paolo Rixai, the man who liked to cut people from the shadows, would never hold a knife again. He would spend the rest of his life staring at walls, shivering from a cold that would never leave his bones. 2 down. Target number 3, Sally DiMarco. Now only the king was left, but a king without an army is just a man with a target on his back. Sally was desperate. He sent word to Dutch Schultz in New York, send more money, send protection, send help. But Bumpy had already anticipated this. Bumpy knew how the mob worked. They didn't back losers, and they certainly didn't back snitches. Bumpy utilized the grapevine, the communication network that ran between prisons. He leaked a rumor to Sing Sing, which traveled to Rikers and finally to the streets of Harlem. The rumor was simple. Sally DiMarco is talking. He's trying to cut a deal with the warden. He's blaming the Dutchman for the hit on Bumpy. It was a lie, but in the underworld, the perception of truth is more powerful than truth itself. Dutch Schultz heard the rumor, and he did what gangsters do. He cut the line. On March 15th, Sally went to the commissary to pick up his weekly order of cigars and chocolates, the perks he paid the guards for. The guard behind the counter looked at him and sneered. "Get out of here, DiMarco." "What?" Sally stammered. "I paid you. The envelope came last week." "Envelope was empty," the guard lied, bribed by Bumpy's influence. "Credit is dead. You're just another inmate now." Sally felt the blood drain from his face. No money meant no protection. No protection meant he was alone in a prison filled with men he had bullied, extorted, and abused for years. He walked back into the yard. It felt different. The air was heavy. Men stopped talking when he passed. They stared, not with fear but with hunger. And sitting on his usual bench, wrapped in his coat, was Bumpy Johnson. Sally walked over to him. He was trembling. The arrogance was gone. He looked small. "Johnson," Sally whispered, his voice cracking. "We can work this out. I have money stashed outside. I can get you 10 grand. Bumpy looked up from his book. He closed it slowly. "You don' t have money, Sally," Bumpy said softly, "and you don't have friends." "Please," Sally begged, looking around at the circling inmates. "They're going to kill me. Call them off. I'll do anything. I'll bow to you." Bumpy stood up. He loomed over the little Italian. "You stabbed me when I was unarmed," Bumpy said. "You tried to kill me in the dark, and now you want mercy in the light." Bumpy leaned in close. "I'm not going to kill you, Sally. I don't have to." Bumpy stepped back and turned his back on Sally DiMarco. That was the signal, the green light. Sally reached out to grab Bumpy's coat. "No, Bumpy, wait." A massive inmate named Big Red, whom Sally had cheated out of gambling money a month ago, stepped in front of Sally. Then another man, then 3 more. They formed a circle around Sally DiMarco. Bumpy walked away toward the gate. He didn't look back. He heard Sally scream. Then he heard the sound of boots hitting flesh. It was a dull, wet thumping sound. It sounded like a butcher tenderizing meat. The guards in the towers watched. They did nothing. The Dutchman had stopped paying them, so they stopped caring. It lasted for 3 minutes. When the circle dispersed, Sally DiMarco was left on the frozen dirt. He wasn't moving. Epilogue: The King of Strategies. Bumpy Johnson survived the winter of 1935. He survived the knife, the steam, and the cold. When he walked out of Dannemora years later, he didn't just walk out as a survivor. He walked out as a legend. He had proven that in the game of power, muscles and knives are useful, but the mind is the deadliest weapon of all. The 3 men who tried to take his crown: Vinny the Hammer died in a state hospital, paralyzed and forgotten. Paolo the Sneak died in the asylum, screaming about the cold. Sally the Boss was buried in a potter's field, an unmarked grave for a man who thought money could buy immortality. And Bumpy went back to Harlem. He sat on his throne, untouchable, because everyone knew the story. Everyone knew what happened to the last men who tried to corner a wolf in the winter. History is written by the winners, but legends are forged by the survivors. Bumpy Johnson didn't just fight, he outthought his enemies. He turned their own strengths into their weaknesses. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real chess game of the underworld, do the right thing. Smash that like button. It helps us keep digging up these buried stories. And tell me in the comments, if you were in Bumpy's shoes, would you have spared Sally, or did he get exactly what he deserved? Subscribe and turn on the bell. Next week we're going back to 1952 to The Rock, Alcatraz, where Bumpy Johnson met the Birdman. You don't want to miss that. Stay sharp, watch your back, and never underestimate the quiet man in the room.